Chris, I've come to Westminster to wish you happy birthday in person.
Oh, thank you. Welcome.
And I've brought...
Welcome back.
a cake.
Oh, this is terrific. So not only are we, in this episode, back in the original home of Newscast, and indeed Brexitcast, Cake returns.
Cake returns. Where's Katja and Laura?
Central plank of the pod in its early years. Can I cut a slice?
Please do. It's chocolate and pistachio.
That is tremendous.
So a very, very fashionable flavour.
Is that right? Is pistachio?
Pistachio's so in right now.
Oh, is it right?
In fact, I think it's maybe post-in. I think it's a bit too ubiquitous now.
Oh, is it?
Can I recommend, though, you don't eat any now?
Okay.
Wait till we've done the podcast, then you can eat some.
Fair enough. This is a test of willpower for the next half an hour.
Some people react quite badly to hearing other people eating.
Well, there is that. I'm just staring at quite a thick layer of pistachio.
Also, because I've been sitting here for a couple of minutes waiting for you to arrive.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not criticising, obviously. And the smell of the icing was just like wafting up my nostrils. So it's going to be quite hard for you to concentrate.
It is.
And there's a lot to concentrate on in this episode of Newscast, because we're going to talk about Sir Olly Robbins, appearing in front of Parliament to talk about Lord Mandelson's vetting when he was made ambassador to Washington. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio at Westminster.
Are they breadcrumbs on the top of this cake?
No, they're crushed up bits of pistachio. Have you never seen a pistachio?
So what's the layered bit in the middle?
Pistachio cream, I think.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay. I assumed the top stuff was something else.
I mean, detail's been a bit of a theme today, hasn't it?
It has. Insufficiently curious. So goes the allegation in various directions, probably mine as well. It's Chris at Westminster.
So we're going to be talking about the big event that happened at Westminster on Tuesday morning, which was Sir Olly Robbins, former Permanent Secretary of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, appearing at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, chaired by Dame Emily Thornberry, who were quizzing him on what he knew about the vetting process when Peter Mandelson was getting ready to go to Washington. Before we dive into the details of the hearing, which was really gripping to watch, it was one of those ones that will kind of go down in history as a dramatic select committee to watch. Let's remind people who Olly Robbins is.
Yeah, so he was the most senior civil servant in the Foreign Office. He'd been doing the job since January of last year, and that's important in the timeline as we'll get to, and we've reflected on in recent episodes. He used to be the most senior civil servant in DECCU, the Department for Leaving the European Union, which you might remember from the Brexitcast era, and had previously rattled around in other civil service jobs. I think he was second permanent secretary at the Home Office.
He'd been Deputy National Security Advisor.
Yeah, so he has been in and around government in the civil service, sort of on and off, principally on, for years and years and years, and was doing, until a matter of days ago, one of the most senior jobs in the British civil service.
Right, let's dive into this hearing, which lasted for, was it about 2 hours?
More than that, about two and a half.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it flew by, though, because it was like watching a film unfold. And actually, there was a debate afterwards in the House of Commons where a Conservative backbencher compared it to A Few Good Men.
Oh, right.
That film with Tom Cruise. Anyway, we'll come on to that later. So the start of this hearing very much was Olly Robbins leaning into what had been happening in the build-up to both his arrival at the Foreign Office and the process of Peter Mandelson's appointment. And we'll play a big chunk of what he explained about the context that he walked into his office to.
When I walked into post as Permanent Undersecretary on the 20th of January last year, I wasn't walking into a vacuum. I arrived to a situation in which a due diligence report had been undertaken into Mandelson by the Cabinet Office, assessing the reputational risks and his fitness for office. The Prime Minister had then presumably taken advice on his fitness for office. The name had been submitted to the King as Minister's recommendation. The Prime Minister had made an announcement that Mandelson was his nominee without caveats. The British government had sought agrément, the formal diplomatic process for a host government accepting a nominee from the US government, and that had been obtained before I arrived in post. He'd been given access to the building, he'd been given access to low classification IT, and from time to time, for case-specific issues, he was being given access to higher classification briefing. So I'm afraid I walked into a situation in which there was already a very, very strong expectation, and you will have seen the papers released already under the humble address, that coming from Number 10, that he needed to be in post and in America as quickly as humanly possible.
Now, none of that is new information, but what was going on there?
Well, beyond our good friend Agremont that featured there, which is the sort of posh diplomatic speak for the country that will be hosting an arriving diplomat being accepted as that country's ambassador. The point there is Olly Robbins saying painstakingly, look, by the time I turned up, because he arrived in January of 2025, Lord Mandelson was effectively at departures at Heathrow Airport, suitcase in his hand, and plane ticket, between his teeth. That was the gist of it. And saying, look, this was done. It wasn't just the will of the government, although it was. It was done. He was going. That was that.
And this was before the developed vetting process, which has become so central, had happened.
Indeed so.
Or concluded, because it was going on in the background.
Exactly. It's before it had concluded that the will of the government was very clear. Of course, it is the role of the civil service to deliver on the will of the government. And then on top of that was the argument that we expected Olly Robbins to make, which was that this developed vetting process, which in his career he's been around or about a lot, in his view, the central tenet of this process is one of confidentiality, is one of respecting the fact that if you're going to ask loads of people who come in to work for the government, that they're going to have this incredibly intrusive set of interviews that's going to crawl over all sorts of aspects of their lives. That there has to be a recognition for those who are willing to sign up to do it, that the detailed information won't go beyond the person they share it with in the interview, even if the conclusions of that crawl all over their life clearly does inform the system as to whether or not they get the job. And that's the crux of the argument that he makes, Olly Robbins makes, which is that he was right not to be sharing this process and what he knew about it with the Prime Minister, and which the Prime Minister thinks categorically he was wrong about.
And I suppose the other implication of what Olly Robbins said there in that big clip that we just played is that the actual outcome of the vetting process was not central to the appointment of Lord Mandelson, but yet it has become central in the Prime Minister and Downing Street and the government's case for why Olly Robbins was dismissed. So he was sort of, in a very elegant civil service way, without actually pointing any fingers, saying what you're hearing from Downing Street is wrong.
Well, the essence, for me, the standout thing in all of the testimony was Olly Robbins effectively saying, these are my words, not his, but the essence of it was Downing Street might be banging on about the importance of vetting now, but they weren't then. So he talked about, for instance, his claim that there was a live conversation going on about whether he even needed vetting, Lord Mandelson. That there was
yes, because the Cabinet Office was, in his telling, was saying, do we even really need to get this guy vetted? And the Foreign Office was pushing back, saying, well, no, the proper thing to do is do the vetting.
Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, has offered an alternative recollection of events around all of that. But yeah, that was Olly Robbins's testimony around that. He also talked about how in the Foreign Office's phones never stopped ringing during this process, with folk in Downing Street saying, is it finished yet? Now, the argument I've heard from people in Downing Street is, look, it's totally normal that private offices will chase things they need sourcing from other private offices. That doesn't mean you're asking them to rush. It's just you're emphasising that it is an important thing that needs doing pretty quickly. And of course, remember the context of the timing. The context of the timing is that the tail end of January 2025 was the inauguration of President Trump into his second term. The whole point of sending out Lord Mandelson is that he was seen to be the perfect candidate for charming the Trump administration. And of course, you want him there pronto because President Trump's about to start.
And that issue of how much pressure was being put on the Foreign Office came to a head in this exchange where an MP on the committee is asking Olly Robbins about a phone call he might have received. And then Emily Thornberry, the chair of the committee, intervenes to clarify that it was quite a sweary phone call. So I'm obliged to tell you that there is some very strong language in this little bit of audio we're going to hear from today's committee.
It is reported by, I think it's Sam Coates, that the Morgan McSweeney, the Chief of Staff, rang Sir Philip and said, in terms stronger than those that I can use before the watershed.
I think you should.
Well, I'll just say that it was just to prove it with terms stronger than that. Does that accord with your impression?
Just f***ing approve it.
Does it accord with your impression when you took over from Sir Philip?
Well,
yes, I mean that gets to the crux of the argument, not expressed in that language, that broadly speaking, Sir Olly Robbins was making, which was that the vibe at the time was not only has this appointment happened, sort out the paperwork and let's get this guy on his way. But crucially, so newscasters understand the subtleties here, and there's a lot of subtleties. Sir Olly was not saying that pressure or that desire to get on with it had any bearing on the judgment he came to when the security vetting process concluded and he was briefed verbally. He didn't see any paperwork. He certainly didn't see the paperwork the government has since published a kind of pro forma version of around what the security vetters had concluded.
Well, yeah, let's take that apart a bit, because that was the next bit I wanted to get on, which is the whole sort of tussle over paperwork. So at the end of last week, you were telling us about how we'd seen this template for the vetting organisation UKSV uses, that their officers use, and there's red, amber and green for whether somebody can get their security clearance or not. And we were told that in this case, or it's been reported in this case, that basically all the red boxes that could be ticked on a vetting form had been ticked for Lord Mandelson. Or maybe they had a cross put in them, we don't know. But Olly Robbins was saying he never even saw that document that has the tick boxes in it.
Yeah, two subtleties here to get across. One is exactly that, the argument that he says he didn't see them. Secondly, that tick box of the traffic lights coming from UK security vetting is not the verdict, if you like. It is the recommendation. And then the Foreign Office come to a decision. But clearly there is a distinction between red boxes ticked and the guy who used to, as a civil servant at least, run the Foreign Office saying, I have never in my career seen this paperwork before. And then on top of that, his view that when he'd been briefed about the conclusions of Lord Mandelson's developed vetting, that conclusion amounted to a leaning from the vetters towards a recommendation of rejection, rather than, as the government says it, that it was those ticked red boxes.
Yeah, it's this new phrase that's entered our lexicon, which was the recommendation was borderline, but leaning towards denial. And I'm just looking at that cake thinking, whether I want that cake right now is borderline, but I'm leaning towards having it.
Yeah, whereas I'm saying...
Which is a beautifully ambiguous way of saying, did you have the cake or not?
Well, completely. Whereas I'm saying I'm definitely having a slice, which is kind of where the government's view is on what it has seen in terms of the ticking of those red boxes. So there's a contradiction there. How can those things possibly align? Now, could it be that with hindsight, neither side were sufficiently curious? So was Olly Robbins poorly briefed about what was really in those documents that he acknowledges he's never seen?
Would it have been helpful for Olly Robbins to not know everything that was in the vetting files, either from a point of view of his responsibilities when it comes to the law and the secrecy of the files, or if he was having to do a job that he was being encouraged to do under a lot of pressure?
Does the absence or him not seeing the documents, or indeed knowing that red boxes had been ticked, actually have any bearing on the conclusion he would have come to if he believes, having been briefed about the necessary mitigations that had caused those red box ticks, was something that he could work around? Perhaps he would have still come to that same conclusion, and the impression left from all of Sir Olly's testimony is, irrespective of how those boxes had been ticked, he would have taken one heck of a lot of persuading, and frankly didn't sound remotely persuadable, that he would have communicated the specifics of that to Downing Street. He did say, though, as somebody who'd overseen a lot of these vetting processes before, that he had in the past, on being presented with the vetters' recommendations, rejected vetting, and in others where perhaps there'd been a suggestion that it was fine, that he'd come to perhaps a more robust view. But in this instance, he felt it it could be worked with. And so that was what he suggested.
And I suppose the whole point he was getting at in that section of the questioning was to rebut this allegation that he'd known something and concealed it from everyone else. He was saying there wasn't the thing to know that could be concealed.
Yeah, so he repeatedly said that there'd been a misunderstanding of this whole process when people had said Lord Mandelson had failed his vetting. And there's two layers to that in Sir Olly's telling of it. One is the argument that says the vetters said Lord Mandelson's failed. Well, it's not really that. They are recommending that clearance shouldn't be granted. They are not the judge and jury. So that's point one. And then secondly, of course, is this point that in his understanding, because of how he was briefed, it wasn't a red box. He'd never even heard of these red boxes, and it was more subtle and nuanced than that.
Although he got a bit of heat from Emily Thornberry in the chair and some of the other committee members, because actually he couldn't provide a lot of evidence for these big assertions he was making, both about the pressure or the dismissive attitude of Downing Street and the Cabinet Office towards the need for vetting in the first place, or this conversation he'd had with his security guy where they were discussing the outcome of this vetting process. There's not a lot of receipts. There's not a lot of emails. There's not a lot of minutes. There's not a lot of faxes. There's not a lot of text messages that back up those big things he was saying.
No, and
not that we've seen today.
No, and then there is an argument around whether or not that is legitimate, because you've got to be very discreet around paper trails, electronic or physical, around this stuff for all the reasons that Sir Olly was making in the broader round. Or does that, to a cynic, add up to being convenient, that kind of stuff is not there? But, we were left with, I think, a sense as a viewer of a former senior civil servant, sort of mesmerised, perplexed and discombobulated by how these last few days have played out.
Oh yeah, he even said, I'm struggling to come to terms or get to the bottom of what actually happened to him.
Yes, and managed sort of gallows humour when the umpteenth MP thanked him for his time, and he said his diary was empty. There was no pressure on his time. I was intrigued though that he did acknowledge that later in the process of if process is the right word, the sort of spectacular unravelling, if you like, of Lord Mandelson's time in Washington and everything that we've since learned, he did say he had sought from the bowels of government a greater sense of what was in.
Oh yeah, he tried to get his hands on it.
And at that point, the system said no. Now, on the one hand, that I suppose you could say burnishes his argument that the system is very careful around this sort of stuff. But then it also suggests that at that point he realised he could be more curious than he was willing to be earlier.
True. My main takeaway from that, though, was him having a pop at the Cabinet Office, who own the whole vetting system. And they were the ones in his telling saying, no, you need a really good national security reason to be able to see these files. In other words, no, you're not seeing them.
I also hear...
Which backs up his point about how secret these things are meant to be, even from the people making the decisions.
I also hear frustration from supporters of the Prime Minister who, confronted by the humble address, this desire that loads of this stuff is published because that's what Parliament has determined, that the whole system is grinding away really slowly. If you're the Prime Minister, publishing all of this stuff is clearly awkward, but your best case scenario is you just get it all out in one go. Now, clearly, there are reasons why it takes time, because there's a gazillion documents and the Intelligence and Security Committee needs to take a look at them to see if there's any national security considerations in publishing stuff, etc., etc. But from the government's perspective, and this is still the reality, there's these deluges still to come where you and I on Newscast and plenty of others are talking about Lord Mandelson, which they would be desperate for us to talk about almost anything else.
And also just in terms of things coming out into the public domain, right at the end, there was, I know I keep using the word dramatic, there was quite a dramatic bit where Sir Olly Robbins said, the fact that this information leaked to a newspaper and has now been reported, he said that was a grave breach of national security and that maybe somebody needs to be prosecuted for that information getting out there, which I thought was, again, a very, very strong criticism implied of the Cabinet Office and the people that are running that organisation.
Yes, and with the clear view from someone steeped in this world that, and again, these are my words, not his, but that this wasn't your typical political leak where a journalist gets a early heads up on some policy coming out of such and such department because it might be in the interest of somebody to scupper it or whatever. I mean, it was that up to a point, but the subject matter being something that in his view puts it on a totally different level. And then, of course, you know, from Downing Street's perspective, in attempting to defend themselves, they've put out in public all sorts of stuff. But who knows whether it would have come out via the humble address? It might have done, but maybe it wouldn't. And irrespective of how it's made its way into the public domain, it is there. And in his view, would be better off not being. I wonder if a sceptic might say, in counter to that the very nature of the instincts and mentality of someone formerly in his position would be to not necessarily be all wildly keen on all of this stuff seeing the light of day. One other thing was to remember, which I thought was really interesting in the context of this, because you might imagine someone in his position, his former position, would be super averse to any risk. And he said, very strikingly, I thought, look, all this vetting stuff is really important. And the reason it's important is we have to attract people into public life or into working for the government. It's often not public in the outward sense, but to working for the government who have had interesting lives, who have had business careers, who've had associations with this country or that country.
And also whose lives and circumstances change, and you've got to accommodate that.
A change and a complicated and all the rest of it, because if you don't do that, and again, my words not his, but the sentiment very much his, you end up with a very narrow gene pool in government, and that is not in the interests of the wider state.
Right, let's talk about the Westminster bombshell that was detonated sort of halfway through.
Yes.
And this involves someone called Lord Doyle, Matthew Doyle, who used to be Keir Starmer's Director of Communications in opposition and then went into number 10 with him as like the top comms guy in Downing Street. This is how Lord Doyle's name came up in the committee. And it was in the context of Olly Robbins being asked by another MP on the committee, has this happened with anyone else? Was there an idea of another political appointee to an ambassadorship somewhere in the world?
I think in my tenure as Permanent Undersecretary, there was only ever one other serious proposal made, and I think that was in March 2025.
What role?
Sorry?
What role?
There were several discussions initiated by Number 10 with me about potentially finding a head of mission opportunity for Matthew Doyle, who was then the Prime Minister's Director of Communications. And I was under strict instruction not to discuss that with the then Foreign Secretary, which was uncomfortable.
I mean, there were about 10 things in that one answer that just make your eyebrows shoot up. And actually, even hearing it for about the 14th time today, I'm still kind of quite surprised.
Yeah.
You were speechless.
Yeah. What?
Yeah.
That was my reaction. And I know this can sound very Westminstery, very Beltway, very SW1. But I could not believe that. And, you know, let's unpack it a bit. So a conversation is had between Number 10 and the guy on the civil service side who leads the...
Well, do you know what? Let's do this like an old GCSE English parsing exercise.
Oh, yeah,
so
okay.
There were several discussions initiated by Number 10. So several discussions.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like a chat in the pub like, oh, should we hire this guy? There was the thing going on here.
Yeah. Then there's and there were discussions with him, so that with the permanent secretary, with the permanent under secretary. Then they're about to do the parsing. You've got the verbatim quotes in front of you, but the heads of mission. That means being an ambassador.
Yeah.
That means being the chief British diplomat in a particular country.
Yeah. Not like a trade envoy who goes on a couple of trips a year and has a nice time, or not some kind of minister job in the Lords that involves some foreign travel, but going and being our man in. And
then Sir Olly very gently puts it that it leaves him uncomfortable, which we can, that translates as a guy who runs a department full of diplomats is horrified that he might have to explain to those diplomats that he's finding a job for a comms guy, getting some bauble, if you like, on the diplomatic chessboard.
Or not just a bauble, but maybe a nice, convenient excuse to move them out of Downing Street.
Well, exactly, which subsequently happened. Oh, and by the way, don't tell the Foreign Secretary.
Who at that point was David Lammy.
which in itself is extraordinary. Now, let's unpack a little bit of this. Because Lord Doyle has, I've been in touch with him, he's put out a statement. He said it was the first he'd heard of it today. So his phone goes bonkers. What? Now, he has worked in foreign affairs before. He worked for Tony Blair when Tony Blair was doing his Middle East role. He worked for David Lammy of the International Rescue Committee. But it's still, it would still be quite the thing. And of course, from Labour MP's perspective, it just leaves the impression of this centre of government trying to find jobs for itself and sort of farm people out in different directions. Now, it's not unprecedented that people in public life switch from one specialism to another, etc., etc. But I mean, crikey, it's quite the thing. And the twist.
No, go ahead.
And the twist here is that Lord Doyle, who was then the Director of Communications, but was effectively got rid of. This, it would appear, was the system aware of the fact that he was going to be got rid of, trying to find an alternative berth for him. I think he made it, he was more keen on staying within domestic politics. He ended up in the House of Lords as a Labour peer, but not for very long, because he was then suspended from the Parliamentary Labour Party after it emerged he'd campaigned for a friend to become a councillor who'd been charged with child sexual abuse offences, and that friend was later convicted. So, what a twist and turn. It's just quite incredible. All within the last 12 months or so, all of that.
And so then this was followed by a debate staged in the House of Commons by the Conservatives, because it was one of those days where the opposition has control of the order paper for a couple of hours. I would say there was a lot of sound, a lot of fury. It didn't signify very much. For example, they didn't manage to pull off what they did last time with the humble address, which was start a process that ended up being really damaging for the government. It was much more of a talking shop.
Yeah, so 3 hours of conversation. I think the Conservatives are proud that they have shifted the dial on all of this stuff. I mean, not least the humble address and all of that, which they brought about. David Cameron, has been doing a lot of advising of Kemi Badenoch recently, both in the context of what we saw yesterday in specifics, but I also hear in terms of Prime Minister's questions prep and all that kind of stuff, which I think is just kind of one to watch. Does he fancy getting a bit more involved in public life? I don't know.
What, another comeback?
Well, who knows? But he is an influential voice around Kemi Badenoch, and they.
And also his old chief of staff, Ed Llewellyn, was the last political appointee made as an ambassador.
So there you go. There's the symmetry, the symmetry of today's news.
Although everyone loved that appointment, no one complains about that.
And he's still a diplomat
in Rome,
in Rome,
and he's a former diplomat as well. So that's what he did before.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, I sorry I've diverted you.
So I think the Conservatives are pretty proud of how they've played this, and it's not the end of it. I mean, there's PMQs on Wednesday. I wonder if in this iteration of this story that began last Thursday, and as we record it's Tuesday night, might be on its downward turn in terms of diminishing returns, but we've still got this next tranche dollop deluge of documents to come in the coming weeks. Do they come before or after the elections? Let's see. Probably after, but I don't know. Let's see. Which means we'll go around this block all over again. And is that then it of the deluge? Let's see again.
I think at the end of today, a few things. Olly Robbins sort of was insinuating that maybe he's going to take legal action against the government. I mean, he didn't say that, but so there's then a process there. And remember when Lord Mandelson was fired in the first place, he then got like tens of thousands of pound payout.
I think it's pretty likely a significant payoff is going to come his way.
What are the consequences of just this horrible atmosphere between the government and the civil service now?
I think that's really interesting. So yesterday you had a handful of retired or former senior civil servants watching down from the House of Commons gallery, and you just got that sense of, where's that? If you're a civil servant, a senior civil servant or a more junior civil servant at the moment, and you see what's happened, I mean, that's, and you're turning up for work every day to serve a government, which is your duty. That's tricky. That is, and I think it explains why those in Downing Street have been going out of their way recently to heap praise on those civil servants, including Cat Little in the Cabinet Office, who have been shepherding this process around the humble address to talk about, which is how this whole thing came to the Prime Minister's attention a week ago, to try and emphasise that, in their view, that is how the civil service should work around the sensitivities of these documents. Downing Street, are having a hearty crack at saying that today the Olly Robbins testimony vindicates their big picture position. And to be fair to Downing Street, there was a whole load of things being said just under a week ago now around the Prime Minister lying and he must have known all along and all that kind of stuff. And, Downing Street's argument is not only has the Prime Minister said he didn't know, Olly Robbins' testimony vindicates that, because he says, no, I didn't tell him because I shouldn't have told him. The thing is, from Downing Street's perspective, I think, when you reflect on those 2.5 hours, modestly expressed, you had a guy who was gently suggesting that the accounts that we've heard from the Prime Minister are not the whole reality, that his reactions in sacking him were unjust and out of proportion and unfair. Now, somebody who loses their job perhaps would say that, wouldn't they? But that's not an ideal position for a Prime Minister to be in at all.
And my last thought on this is watching Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, who's doing the morning round this morning, chatting to all the broadcasters. And he's got a very interesting policy actually today about energy prices, which maybe we'll go into one year if there's stop being scandals that distract us from it. And he basically had this whole sort of like world-weary thing of all the journalists were rightfully asking him questions about who knew what, when, what is this real about the government? And he was just sort of at the end of every interview just going, yeah, you know what? Like, I've got nothing more to say. It was a bad decision. It was bad judgment, bad for the government, bad for the country, which this never had happened. You sort of realise this whole story, that the scandal cycle has got a bit scrambled in that would be normally the full stop to the scandal. A government going, we really mucked up here. We're sorry. This has been a disaster for us. That's what you would do once everything had come out. You'd been accused of everything under the sun. Unfortunately for this government, from their point of view, that's what they did first.
Yeah.
And then all the stuff came out after that. And so it means that what do you do when your full stop is at the start of the sentence rather than the end? You've got nowhere else to go.
And I thought Ed Miliband this morning as well, particularly in his interview with Sky News, was willing to say, because the government and the Prime Minister now acknowledge that this was a spectacular, catastrophic error of judgment, to appoint Lord Mandelson, Ed Miliband was willing to say, because it's his authentic view, and we've known his scepticism about Lord Mandelson going back 15 years to when he became the leader of the Labour Party, that he feared at the point of appointment of Lord Mandelson that it might go wrong. And he said, and so did David Lammy, which again is articulating in public some of those conversations that were going on beforehand, saying to Downing Street, are you blooming sure? And of course, they were. And they've been reaping the consequences of it ever since.
Right, Chris, good to catch up. Happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
Have we got some agrément that we're going to have a slice of cake now?
Yes, I think we have. Look at this. What was it? Pistachio?
And chocolate. And it has been massively distracting me this whole
look at
episode.
the integrity of that holding up.
This is like a really cheap version of Bake Off.
Just beautifully.
Right. That's all for Newscast. We'll be back with another episode very soon. Bye-bye.
Great crumb structure.
But no soggy bottom.